Let's see, get a little light here. Good evening, I'm Jan Schall, Sanders Soslin Curator at the Nelson-Atkins, and I'm so happy to see you all here this evening. A nice crowd for a wonderful artist who's going to speak to us about his work. Tonight's lecture is held in conjunction with our featured exhibition, Sparks, the William T. Kemper Collecting Initiative. The exhibition features 36 works of art acquired through the generous support of the William T. Kemper Foundation Commerce Bank trustee. That gift of $1 million a year for 10 years, and we are now in the middle of year 9, has been a remarkable gift. It has transformed our modern and contemporary collection. It has given really new life and spark to the museum. So we're thrilled at what it means to all of us and what the exhibition and what these events mean for all of us. The foundation also sponsored this evening's presentation. Our speaker tonight is Kerry James Marshall. His Memento 5 is the final painting in his Memento series, and it's on view in this exhibition. If you have not had a chance to see it, you'll want to run down and have a look at that later on. It's an elegy to the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the tumultuous era that was. Many of us lived through it. Many of us were stunned by things we experienced during that period. But ultimately, on the other side, I think America came out in a better place, working for better progress in many levels. So it was what a time, as Kerry says, and he'll talk more about that. Kerry James Marshall lives and works in Chicago. He was born in Birmingham, lived for a while in Watts. His parents still live in California, and he has been teaching in Chicago for years, a dedicated teacher, dedicated professor, as well as a dedicated artist, and always reaching, always striving for new ways of looking and thinking about his life, our lives, and really the life of history. The paintings on one level are intimate and revealing, and on the other hand, they are really historical paintings that tell us something about the world that we live in and have lived in and continue to move through. In 1997, Kerry was the recipient of the prestigious John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Fellowship, colloquially known as the Genius Fellowship. So you know in what category he stands. He's blushing. His work has been the subject of numerous one-person exhibitions, including those at the Wexner Center, the Renaissance Society, the Chicago Museum of Contemporary Art, and the Studio Museum in Harlem. His work's been featured at the Whitney Biennial, the Venice Biennale, and this summer at the Casal Documenta exhibition. And an exhibition of his brand new work just opened last week at the Jack Shainman Gallery in New York. So if you're heading that direction, be sure you visit the Shainman Gallery. Please join me in welcoming this evening Kerry James Marshall.
This is a mercifully short introduction, so the expectations are still kind of low. So I don't have a lot to live up to right now. But I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Jan and the staff at the Nelson-Atkins for the invitation to come and speak, for being a part of the collection and all of that stuff. This is my second or third time in Kansas City area, because I came here first when I had a show at Johnson's County Community College, which was the first place. Bruce Hartman, who I don't think is in the house. Is he? There he is. We were just talking about you. Be very afraid. But Bruce, who also purchased the painting for the collection at Johnson's County Community College. And this was one of those really odd and kind of amazing things. It's like, well, first, it's a community college. But a community college with a gallery like the Johnson's County Community College Gallery, it's like there's no place like that on the planet. And with the collection they have, it's like, this is unbelievable. It's kind of an exceptional place. And then to come back here now with the Nelson-Atkins having made its expansion the way it is, with those amazing galleries on the other end, this is like Kansas City is jumping. So, yeah, it's like now you buy a ticket to come to Kansas City. Just to come to Kansas City. So anyway, so thank you all for coming out. You can see how much support the museum has, I think, just by the depth of the audience here. So this is all a good thing. Well, so we'll talk about a few things. Maybe we'll start with this slide that's up here now. It's like in the title of this talk, the Kerry James Marshall Old School Artist. And I titled it that because this is really important, because I think a lot of what I want to talk about really is work, and not so much kind of my work per se, but work. I mean, it's like what it takes kind of to be an artist, to make your work and to sustain a kind of career, which is what everybody wants. It's like everybody who wants to be an artist, they want to have a career. It's like I don't know anybody out there who just wants to make stuff to stick in the closet, or make stuff that they can pile in a storage shed somewhere. I don't know anybody like that, who just wants to make that kind of work. I mean, you want to be where everything is happening. You want to be in the middle of it. You want to be in the thick of things. And I always wanted to be in the thick of things when I started out, imagining myself to be an artist. And I'm one of those people who really, really was fortunate to know when I was really young what I wanted to do with my life, even though I didn't know being an artist was what it was called. I knew I wanted to make pictures. And so that gave me sort of a head start. And it would have been a real head start if I had had any real talent, like any real raw talent. The kind of stuff that people say you're born with for people who are supposed to be born to be artists. But I didn't have any of that, and so I had to find another way. And I think I was lucky enough that the way I found had to do more with what you knew than with any kind of innate talent or ability you were born with. And that turned out to be the key to everything for me. And it's what led me to do the kind of work I do, and it's sort of got me to a place where I'm standing up here talking to you. And I know there's some young people who are in school across the street who aspire to be in a place where they're standing up here talking to somebody else, because that's a part of what it's all about. But Jan said something earlier that I think was really important, and I think it's gonna become an element in my presentation shortly. When she talked about the gift that the Kempers gave to the museum and how that transformed the museum and allowed them to develop the contemporary art collection in ways that they wouldn't have if they hadn't had that gift. And so one of the things you have to think about when you're talking about art in general, or if you want to know something about art, you got to follow the money. So you always hear people say that, follow the money. Because the thing is, it's always been the money that has helped artists to develop over time, to practice their work, to hone their skills, to aspire to the great kinds of achievements that a lot of artists have. I mean, artists, you don't just do a lot of stuff like we do on speculation. I mean, at a certain point, somebody's got to back you up. You got to get some patronage somewhere. You got to have some support. Richard Serra wouldn't be doing, the 20-ton steel pieces if he didn't have any money. And if you remember, I don't know how many people watch Charlie Rose, because, Richard Serra was on Charlie Rose once. This was right after 9/11, and that was actually one of the best interviews with an artist I had ever seen, especially on television, because he talked about what he did so clearly and so honestly, and then I was inspired. I mean, and I used that lecture. I recorded it, and I used that lecture often in my class when I was teaching, because I think this is what it's really about. I mean, he really clarified what his ambition was. He told you exactly what his methodology was, and then he told you how important it was for Leo Castelli to support him to the tune of $500,000 in the 60s, with no prospect of ever getting a return on that money because nobody knew about that work was going to make any money at the time. But there was somebody who believed enough in the importance of what he was doing to be able to support the work with no hope of having a return on it. And it was the thing that made it possible for him to explore the things he explored and then to get to that place where his stuff could kind of consolidate and then it could break. So if we follow the money, let me go with my first slide. If you follow the money, we are in a moment now where, an object like this can come on the scene. And I think when an object like this arrives on the scene in the art world, it changes everything. It changes everything. Now, it sets the marker that everybody else, I think, needs to aspire to on some level. And it's not just this object, but it's objects like that. Too, by Jeff Koons. And then if you were in New York and you saw the Murakami show at the Brooklyn Museum, then you understand that there's right now a generation of artists who are operating at such a high kind of commercial level, kind of corporate level, that are able to produce works of magnificent scale and finish and intricacy and all of those things. To operate you could probably argue the last gasp of capitalism, where the excesses of money are making these kinds of things possible, but at a moment in history where it's virtually impossible for that to continue for long. And I don't know how long, but you can't keep raising the bar like that for long before the whole thing sort of collapses. But in the meantime, the artists who are coming out of school now have to deal with that. You've got to come to terms with the existence of those kinds of works in the field that you're trying to enter into. And so how do you make work of modest scale and modest scope in the face of, studios like Jeff Koons, who is like on some of the small scale, when he says he's got 75 people working for him in his studio producing that work. Damien Hirst was on Charlie Rose. He's got 150 people working in his studio. And Murakami's got that many, maybe even more, working for him. So how do you, and they flood the marketplace with works like these that enter the market with that skull at $100 million. The Jeff Koons work sort of enters the market at $25 million, 20 and 25. So how do you, and the Murakami stuff is like that too, how do you make work in an environment in which artists who are getting all the attention, because all the attention is being drawn towards them. So how do you make work in an environment like that? Well, I tell you, it's tough. It's tough. And for me, this whole thing, this old school thing, because it's like for most artists start out undercapitalized, you would have to say. And I think in a lot of ways, for African-American artists starting out, you are doubly undercapitalized because we've never been in a position where we controlled any of these capital markets. We don't control any of the funds that sort of generate these kind of high capital volumes. And so you're always sort of stuck in a position, we're starting out in a position where there's virtually no network that you can enter into that might have the kind of confidence in what you would produce to back you at the level that these artists are being backed. And so you're sort of in a position where you've got to try on your own with the limited resources you have as an individual, as a single person. You've got to try to produce something that finds a place in the market. And I mean, by markets, I don't just mean the dollars and cents kind of market where people are spending money and buying work, although that's really important. That's really important. You can't underestimate the value of that. But to find a place even in the kind of critical marketplace where people are writing about and talking about the value and the importance of the things you make. So we're trying to do a lot of things at once. You're trying to, at one time, make work that is challenging enough to gain some attention from the critics and the historians who write about art, that's meaningful enough for the audience that operates within this little narrow space we call the art world, and that has a broad enough appeal to draw audiences like you into the museum to come and look at it. I mean, these are all the things that artists are trying to do. And then on top of that, for the artists themselves, you're also trying to find some way to make a place for yourself in the historical narrative of the art forms. Because the ultimate goal, and in some ways it's difficult to achieve unless you get all of those other things, the ultimate goal is to have a place in history that is meaningful. To have your work able to be used as an example that helps tell the story of what can and cannot be a work of art, and what the nature of any variety of works of art in a particular genre ought to look like at a given time. Which means, in my case, it was, well, what kinds of paintings can you make in the 1980s and 1990s? What kinds of paintings can you make given the incredible archive of paintings that we have access to from the historical record? I mean, and these are paintings all the way back from medieval paintings up to the contemporary moment. How do you make work that is meaningful for painting in an environment where so much other great work already exists? So this is what the challenge was, and this is how I started out. I'm going to try not to dwell too long on any one of these sides. So when we talk about the work, about what it takes, this is a photograph of my studio just before I was getting ready for the show in New York. And these are works that are in that show in New York. And so I'm going to show a couple of slides of the interior of the studio, but can you see how much chaos is going on in there? So that's one view, and another view, another view. But the thing is, you have to have so much stuff in play in order to keep the development of ideas and formal strategies for making images work for you, that you never get a chance to stop. And you have to be, in some ways, so I think, at least highly self-conscious about all of the things that you're doing, all the moves you make, and you have to look at what the relationship between those things are and all the other kinds of things that are being made at the time. We'll get back to some of these things later on and have some questions about stuff. So, but did somebody say something? But this is a part of what I'm going to try to do with the slides and things I'm showing is just kind of show a sampling of things. And this sampling of things says something about the scope of my thinking and how all of those things relate to my ultimate ambition, which is to find some way to gain a really secure position in the historical narrative of painting yet to be written. And I'll talk about why I think that's important. But let's look at a few pictures first with very little comment. And then we're going to be sort of going backwards in time. We're going to move, this is like a time machine. We're going to go backwards and forwards in time. It's just a kind of zigzag. You know, these are not going to be the greatest images I have to tell you, just because I'm switching over like everybody else from slides to PowerPoint. And the transition can be rough and bumpy sometimes. But this gives you some sense of the current sort of body of work I've been making. And as you see, there's a kind of theme that's kind of emerged here. And there's just a few things. And then we go from those themes to the artist. And I'll say a little bit about this, beginning with this picture, because this is, the title of this painting is Scipio Moorhead, A Portrait of Himself, 1776. And the thing is, and the reason that's important is because the idea of the artist is an important notion for me. And in particular, the idea of the African-American artist or the black artist is an important thing. And I made this painting of Scipio Moorhead, of whom there is no kind of self-portrait, there is no representation. But Scipio Moorhead, for me, would have been the first African-American artist. That's why the title is important. And we only know about Scipio Moorhead because he made a portrait of Phyllis Wheatley, who was a young slave poet of the Wheatley family, who published a book of poems in 1774. Was published in England because they couldn't get it printed in the United States. But we only know about him because in one of the poems she wrote, she pays tribute to this young artist, Scipio Moorhead, who was also a slave, who did this image that was used at, the engraving is the frontispiece for her book. That's the only image that's the only existing image by Scipio Moorhead. And it's the only other record of Scipio Moorhead that we have. And so I made a fictional self-portrait of Scipio Moorhead as a representative figure of the first African-American artist who sort of starts this whole process of the kind of black arts movement and all of that stuff going. So that's the painting. It's my representation of his self-representation. But beyond the Scipio Moorhead painting, this idea of the artist is something that I'm really interested in. And the Scipio Moorhead painting was a painting from last year that I showed in a show at the National Portrait Gallery. But this is a painting that's in the show in New York. And there's a series of these paintings. There are three of them in that show. This one, and this one. And the thing is, like, what are they about? Well, they are about representation and abstraction. And the way in which this question of whether to represent or not has been one of the central issues in the struggle for recognition, I would say, amongst African-American artists from the time of Scipio Moorhead to the present. Because there's been this assumption that in order to be considered a real artist, and a kind of universal artist or a mainstream artist, that somehow carrying the black figure representation into that work was an obstacle. And so during the 60s and the 70s, a lot of black artists went for abstraction because they thought that was a way that they could be recognized as real artists without carrying the burden of race along with them. Because if you could detect from the kinds of images that people made that they were an African-American artist, then they might not be given the kinds of opportunities that mainstream artists would get. And so these figures sort of stuck, these sort of not stuck necessarily, but they exist somewhere between various forms of abstraction. And in this case, the abstraction, both in all of those paintings, the abstraction as represented by the palette and by the wall behind the figure, these are all incidental occurrences, abstraction as an incidental event, as a phenomena that sort of occurs, whereas the representation of the figure is something that has to be more self-consciously articulated. And so, but you have these three different levels of representation in these paintings. And so that's what these were sort of about. And I don't know how many people read Dave Hickey, who's the kind of critic. Somebody's applauding. But he has this notion, this idea that people are not interested in artworks really because of what they are about, that they are interested in artworks because of what they do, meaning how they perform and what they represent, what the existence of those works represent. And for me, what these works do is position the black figure representation between, kind of in the middle of, abstraction. So we'll move on. And now we'll go back to some earlier kinds of images, and then we're going to go back, and then we'll come forward again. And I show works like this because in the beginning I started out, you got to try a lot of stuff. And the other thing about the art world, in a way, you're only as good as the last thing you did, which means that you have to always be inventing in the art world. You have to always be inventing, which means you got to figure out some kind of way to manage the generation of ideas so that you don't run out before your lifetime is spent. And so I started out with mythologies, doing a lot of work that was based on mythology, but always sort of trying to position this sort of black figure in the midst of this kind of mythology. And works like this, I had started collecting. When I got to Chicago, I discovered like this great thing in Chicago. They had secondhand stores in Chicago, like chains of secondhand stores. And you could buy books, and it was a nickel a piece for any book. It's like any book, 5 for a quarter. And I started buying Harlequin romance novels, hundreds of them, by the hundreds. And well, why was I interested in those Harlequin romance novel covers? Well, in part because if you look at the images on the cover, I think they're really beautiful images. But those images, since I was doing work that was sort of based on overturning stereotypes and things like that, but you can look at the images on the Harlequin romance novels, and they're no less stereotypic than the images that you might see of black people from the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And so combining those images with the images that I was working on, it seemed to say something about the ways in which stereotypical images are privileged on one side or another. So anyway, I was interested in mythic images. This is sort of a La Venus Negra kind of image, but it's a black mermaid. And I was in a copy shop once, and there was a woman standing next to me at the counter, and I was making some color copies of that image from a slide. And the woman looked over, she said, "There ain't no such thing as a black mermaid." I thought. But you see, that's why I'm making images like that. So that people it's like these ideas, these notions of what can and can't be. It's like what kinds of things can and can't be represented, what exists and what's not real. And that reminds me of something for all the people who are interested in science fiction out there. If you remember, there's the great science fiction writer, Octavia Butler. There you go. Who tragically died in a fall 2 years ago. Tragically. But one of the great science fiction writers, I think, of all time. She has a great trilogy of books, the best of which is one called Wild Seed. And if you don't read any science fiction novel, read Wild Seed. It's one of the greatest books of all time, as I like to say. And it's got one of the greatest characters. Doro is his character in the book. It's one of the great characters. So get that book if you get a chance. And the thing is, like, you don't encounter a lot of black people writing science fiction. And Octavia Butler was one of the only black women at the time who was writing science fiction and doing it really well and getting a lot of credit for it. But she used to say too that whenever she said invariably whenever I went to do a talk somewhere, some black person would always come up to me at the talk and say, what does science fiction have to do with black people? And the thing is, like, and that's why we make work for that. So that people sort of get these notions out of their head that only certain people make certain kinds of things and that only certain kinds of images are possible. And that's a big part of this whole drive to be a part of the historical narrative that I talked about earlier. Because if we assume, and it's not hard to arrive at this conclusion when you go to the museums a lot. It's not hard to believe that black people really don't make a lot of art. And if they do make art, they didn't start making art until the 20th century. Because if you think about it, I go to the Art Institute in Chicago. And when you first walk into the museum, you're down on that first floor. And to the left, when you come in, is the African art wing. And it's a corridor, the African art corridor. And so that work is situated near where the primitive and the ancient sort of work exists. So you go in there, and then you come out and you go into the museum proper. And then you can walk through the medieval period. So you can go from the 14th century through the 15th century, through the 17th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century. You will never encounter another work by a black person until you get to the 20th century section, which means, in the minds of most people, when you go to the museum, that black people they didn't make anything for 700 years. And they certainly didn't make anything for 700 years that was worth putting in a museum. And so for most people, we take that for granted because that's the way the museums are when we arrive. When we are born, that's the way the museums are. But for people who want to make art and who want to find a place for themselves in those museums, that becomes a problem at a certain point. And for me, it became a problem at a certain point because I like all of that stuff too. It's like I like everything. One of my favorite artists when I used to go to the LA County Art Museum was Veronese. They had two great paintings by Veronese in that museum. I used to go there just to see those. And then all of the other stuff they had some great Rembrandt work there. They had a lot of really incredible work. And they had some amazing African art, too, in the African art wing. But the thing is, like, well, if I'm aspiring to be a part of that pantheon of artists who are represented by all of these people, let's say from Giotto to Robert Rauschenberg, since Rauschenberg just died. So if you aspire to be a part of that chain of development and that chain of achievement, and you notice that nobody like you has been a link in that chain, it's like up to the 20th century, then what do you do about that? Well, my response to that is to try to figure out what it was about those artists that were there already that made it possible for them to first do the work they were doing and get there. But then what is it about the people who make those selections that makes that work more useful for telling the story than other things people have made? And in trying to figure out what what that difference is, like what the key is to that kind of importance and that kind of significance, then that's where you locate the kind of work you do. I mean, to me, and I don't think the challenge has changed any at all. Not only is it a challenge for African American artists and other artists of color who were never represented in that historical timeline, but it's a challenge for any artist that wants to make a name for themselves in the field that they choose. Because we do know that even though there's been a proliferation of art schools and MFA programs in the United States and elsewhere in the world, graduating thousands and thousands of students every year, the percentage of those students who end up either, one, continuing to make work after they graduate from school, showing their work in a gallery, having their work collected by museums, having it written about critically, getting the big grants and awards and stuff like that, the percentage of people who get those is so small. I mean, it really is under 5%. It's under 5%. And so that means you have two choices. One is you could leave those kinds of results to chance and hope you are lucky enough to be chosen as one of the select few to make it in there, or you can look and operate strategically and really try to understand exactly what the mechanism that makes the existence of those artists in the museum possible and aim your energy towards that. And I think if you aim your energy towards that kind of approach, you will be more likely than not to achieve what you're after than if you leave it by chance. Because if you're leaving it by chance, then you're saying, well, who is it that's going to be out there making those decisions about who gets in and who's not in? And I'd say if those decisions are being made by people you don't know, then my favorite for you, are in a world of trouble. Because the one thing you can know for sure is that if it's people you know, they're probably people who don't have your best interest at heart. And I think the stakes are too high. At least certainly it was for me. They are too high to leave those kinds of things to chance. And so I've been involved all along in trying to find some kind of way to strategically put myself in a position where I would be more likely than not to be in there, and to be more in control than not in control. Because the part that's not in control, if you are not in control of it, then you've surrendered your future, in a sense, to refined sensibilities. That means that there has to be somebody out there who is so perfectly in tune with you, like the one out of 150,000 who graduated. There has to be somebody who is so in tune with just you in order for you to, it's like playing the lottery. You know, you just as well to play the lottery every week as to have somebody pick your work out of a crowd and say, yeah, this guy's got that thing. But I think it's possible to know what it is. And the proof is in if you read what other artists who we admire have said about their ambition. And I don't think anybody said it better than Andy Warhol. And that's like, I read a great article in American Heritage magazine, of all places, like the last place you would expect to find a really great article on art and art history. And I came across this magazine in a thrift store again. And this article was how pop turned the art world upside down. And the article was a whole history of the first year that pop art came on the scene in New York, and Henry Geldzahler's role in that. It was an amazing moment. But there were two things in there that really struck me. There were two comments, one by Roy Lichtenstein and one by Andy Warhol. But another thing that really struck me about the article is that the author of the article said, in the whole history of pop art, there are only two artists whose work really matters. Everybody else is inconsequential. And those two artists were Roy Lichtenstein and Andy Warhol. He said everything else is secondary. Now, there are people making those kinds of judgments all the time. But you don't want to be in the downside of that judgment. And you read in that article what Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein both said. There was a place in there where Roy Lichtenstein was asked why he switched from doing abstract painting to painting those cartoon images. And his response was, because there was no place for me between Milton Resnick, and I saw a big Milton Resnick painting out there in the museum. There was no space for me between Milton Resnick and all the other second-generation abstract expressionist painters who were working at the time. So I had to do something that would distinguish myself from that group. And then Andy Warhol had said in the article about his comic book images, because, they were both doing comic book stuff in the beginning, those early Andy Warhol, Dick Tracy's and stuff. And so Andy Warhol said, when I saw Roy Lichtenstein's cartoon imagery, I knew it was much better than mine. And so I had to find another direction to go in, a direction in which I would come out first. So that says something about not only how they see themselves, but how they see the kind of competitive nature of the field in which they are operating. And so it's like, well, why is it then that generations of other artists, and especially when we go to art school, we are told somehow that there's no mechanism that you can control that will determine whether you have a place in the pantheon or not. We are told that things just sort of happen. You just do your work, and somehow or other somebody's going to pick you out of the crowd and make your career for you. That's not the way it goes. I mean, I don't think it was the way it went for anybody who had any ambition and who we sort of look to as models now. You can go back through Gauguin, you can go through Van Gogh, you can go back to Leonardo, all of those artists. None of them were operating in a kind of chance environment. They were struggling to distinguish themselves from everybody else who was making work so that they could get the commissions and keep their studios open. That's how you do it. You look at the field and you say, well, what's not there? And then you do that. But the notion that making art is about expressing oneself, I think, is the greatest misconception about what it is that artists are doing that has ever been perpetrated on generations of people who wanted to be artists. Because it's not about self-expression. It's about how to fit your expressive interests into a treatment that is meaningful for the discipline that you are involved in. So when I make work, I only make work about things that matter to me, that things I care about. But I am always thinking about what that treatment should be, what the thing is supposed to look like. What does it need to look like? And the need for it to look a certain kind of way doesn't have anything to do with how I feel about it per se, but it has something to do with how useful that treatment might be and what kind of performance it will have in the field when I put the work out there. And so, anyway, I ramble on about that kind of stuff for a while, but let me go through. I'm just going to show some more pictures. So these are these are earlier works, in which you can see how a lot of what I've been doing is sort of positioning the sort of black figure. I mean, in a kind of in absolute terms, within a variety of different modes of painting. And in the beginning, for a long time, I did a lot of collage work. Sort of after Romare Bearden. I looked at a lot of Kurt Schwitters. I looked at a lot of work, Joseph Cornell. I looked at a lot of those people's work, and Betty Saar, and all those people. And I did a lot of collage work. And then I got to a point where, and I was doing a lot of abstract collages at a period too, but I got to a point where doing those abstract collages sort of, they yielded a certain amount of satisfaction, but I could understand that they really weren't doing all the work that I needed them to do. But what I was learning from those collages was a lot about color and shape. And so you do some things because you want to learn how to control space, you want to learn how to control surface, you want to learn how to control texture, all of those things. You do work because that's what you need to know about, and that's what that kind of work allows you to learn. And then you take all that information and you start to apply it to other things later. And this work, it's called Distyle. And it's called Distyle because there's some compositional devices that are consistent with the Dutch sort of movement, the style, the sort of rectilinear kind of rotation of rectangles and squares and things like that. So there are things like that. But it's also Distyle because it's about this kind of hair, investment in hair and this kind of shapes and things like that. But this painting is important to me because the very first art museum I ever went to as a young person was the LA County Art Museum. When I was in 5th grade, or whatever that year is, they take you on the field trip to the museum. Whatever that year. So I went to the museum, and that place, it was like really going to Valhalla. Because she's like, here's a place. It's like, and it's loaded, it's full of all these pictures and stuff. And I used to love to go there and kind of hang out. But that's where I first had my first encounter with like real art in the museum. It's where I first recognized there was a kind of absence of representation of black figures in the museum and black artists. And this was the first major museum purchase of a work of mine by the LA County Art Museum. And it's purchased on terms that were established by me to solve what I thought was a fundamental problem in the presence of black artists in the museum. One was that, first of all, if there were works by black artists in museums, they were either in there on such a modest scale as to be easily overlooked. So you can walk past some stuff and not even know it was in there. And this painting is 10 foot by 10.5 feet. There's no going by it without noticing that it's there. And so one of the first principles is that if you're going to play in the big leagues or you're going to play in the big game, you got to play at a scale and at a level that everybody else is playing at. And so that was my strategy, was to make work that operated on all those same levels. And not only on those levels, but had some art historical references within it that made it clear to the people who were making those choices that this work was knowing, that it knew itself, that it knew what it was about. It wasn't something that just happened. It was something somebody made, and they made it to perform a certain kind of function. So all those things, these are the reasons why I think my work ended up in the museum, because I attached it to all of the kind of classical compositional models and structures that all of the people who are curators in those museums appreciate. And now they have to appreciate it with that image. So you do that, and then you add all the other stuff you want to on top of that too. And the reason why that kind of thing is important, it becomes clear later on. I mean, it has to do with this historical importance, is that not only are we making work because we want to be a part of the pantheon, but we want the work that we make to have an effect on the kinds of things that younger artists who are following us think they're able to do. And I was talking to Kehinde Wiley once, and he was saying, when he was living in LA at the time, but it's like, he read an interview that I gave, and in that interview, I talked about how I felt going to the museum and seeing the work of Charles White, and Romare Beard and David Hammond, all those people. He said, the stuff you were saying, the way you talked about how you felt in front of those artists' work, that's how me and some of my friends felt when we were standing in front of yours. We said those same kinds of things while we were standing in front of your work. That's sort of what it's all about. Because now you have a life and a meaningfulness in the lives of other young people who want to be artists too. And that reveals to you, I think, on some level, what it is artists are really all about. Because artists don't make work because they want to express themselves. They make work because other artists made work that made them excited. And we want to be one of them. We want to be like those guys. So anyway, so that work was important. And that was a milestone for me, sort of a plateau. It's a kind of a breakthrough work. And then I did a series of works that follow a kind of a pattern. And this pattern is, if you look at that first work, you could call my version of a kind of history painting. I mean, it's the scale and all of that stuff that constitutes history painting. But if you notice, the reason why those history painters made those big paintings like they did was so they could get portrait commissions. That was what the Salon was all about. They made those great big paintings on spec to demonstrate what they could do. And then when they demonstrated what they could do, then patrons would come to them to get portraits, and that's where they made their money. And so my work sort of goes up and down in these two scales. So you do the big things, and then you do the small things that are sort of portrait-like. And I did a series of portraits that were based on the Scouts. I'm only going to show two. There's the Boy Scout and the Girl Scout. But there's also a Brownie and a Cub Scout and a Scoutmaster and a Den Mother. So it's the whole suite. And these are kind of quintessentially American-like icons through these organizations. So I did a group of those. And then there's a group of paintings, one of which I'm going to show Bruce, the painting that's over at Johnson County, is a part of this group of paintings called the Garden Project. And they are housing projects in Chicago that had garden as a part of their name. And so they are kind of pastoral work. And this is the one that's at Johnson County. Talk about foresight. Bruce. That guy's got a good eye. And you can see how that collage sensibility that you saw in the earlier painting with the boat and the way I talked about the collage, you can see how that collage sensibility is still kind of present in these works. So anyway, there were a group of those. So that's one called Outgale Gardens. And this was the one sort of autobiographical one. This is in St. Louis at the St. Louis Art Museum. And this is when my family moved from Birmingham to Watts. We moved to the Nickerson Garden Projects on 111th Street. And our apartment was actually just to the right over there. We lived right off the place. There was a big field between our place and the projects on the other side, and then the gymnasium, which was just behind where we were. So we used to kind of hang out in the field out there. But that's when we moved there. And that painting is called Watts 1963, which is the year we went to California from Alabama. But it's called Watts 1963 for what it portends in 1965, when the Watts riots breaks out. And so there's a kind of overinvestment in a lot of things in those works. It's like there's a kind of painterliness, and then there's the imagery, and then there's the sunshine and the bluebirds and the blah, blah, blah. It's all so wonderful. But it was going to turn. And it's about this anticipation of the moment when this is all going to turn. So there's Wentworth Gardens in Chicago, which is near. When we live in Chicago on the south side now, right near Wentworth Gardens. We live near Robert Taylor and Stateway Gardens and Wentworth Gardens. Now the Robert Taylor and Stateway are all gone now. They've torn all that down. Wentworth, they just finished doing a renovation at Wentworth Gardens, and people are just now moving back in. But Better Homes, Better Gardens is the title of that painting. And these are big paintings. That's 13 feet long. 9.5 feet high, 13 feet. So this is a good size. Was it to make no small art? People say. This is a painting called Pastimes. And this was going to be, when you're making work, you can, you move through different ways of treating the subject in your work. And for me, this was going to be the last painting I was going to make that had that collage sensibility. So I always do this thing where you kind of got to finish a group of paintings. And I don't just make a lot of things just because I can make a lot of things. I probably would be smarter if I did, because I could make more money. But I'm pushing towards something. And so that requires me to continue to renovate the work that I'm doing from time to time. And I think to figure out new ways to use that black figure without it becoming too tedious. And this is a show, and this show and everything that I think we're going to see from now on sort of really encapsulates where I am now, kind of as an artist. And you can see how I think through a variety of different strategies and approaches. So this is from a show at Mass MoCA in North Adams, Massachusetts. And all these works are mine. So the sculpture is mine, the black painting is mine, and the comic strip stuff is mine. And I'm doing all of these things simultaneously. And the reason for that has to do with this ambition. Because the truth is that you don't make it really into this select group of people unless you figure out some kind of way of deploying an image or creating a painting that changes the notion that people have of things like that. And the only way you can really arrive at that, I mean, it's not something that comes over you in an inspirational moment like a lightning bolt. It's something that you have to construct. But you can only do that when you have the raw material for all of these component parts that you put together and then at some point synthesize into this new thing. And so what I do is I take all of the formal devices that artists use and I go inside. So you understand the logic of these things and how they work from the inside out, and you try to make new work using the logic of those things rather than just simply copying something that somebody else made. And so I made a black painting that's a narrative painting. And Ed Reinhardt made the black paintings, and when Ed Reinhardt made the black paintings in the 60s, he said, "I'm making the last paintings that can be painted." He says, "I'm turning the lights out on painting." Because painting is about perception, it's about seeing, it's about color, it's about all those things. So when he made the black paintings, he said, "I'm making the last paintings that can be painted." But those paintings were just sort of formal exercises in a way. There was imagery in there, even though it was difficult to see. But when your eyes adjusted to it, like they do when you're in the dark, your eyes adjust and you can see stuff. But I made a painting that had, it's like, nobody made black paintings that had narrative content, really. And so I made a black painting that had a lot of narrative content. And there's a couple in the bed, and it's got a lot of stuff going on in the room they're in. But it's at such a low level that, from here, you can't tell there's anything in there. It's that couple, and it's like that moment in the middle of the night when somebody wakes up. The woman wakes up and she sort of gets up and is leaning on one elbow, looking at the guy who was over in the bed next to her. It's just like that moment when you got a question about how did I end up here or something, But that's what the painting. That's what's happening in that painting. But I also made this sculpture, this figure, and I'll show another view of it. And this is that pixelation won't go away, so we got to do the best we can with that. And the piece behind it is from a group of work called the Rhythm Master. This is that comics-based thing. But that sculpture, here's another view of it. It's like, well, if we go back to the thing I was talking about with the African sculpture in the museum, everybody knows the kind of story of the way in which African art and oceanic art and other things that people call tribal arts, were used as a kind of catalyst, a kind of springboard for the development of a lot of modernist strategies of deconstructing the figurative representation. So everybody knows the Picasso's use of African art and things like that. Well, now, in a way, that work sort of poses a dilemma for African American artists. Because on the one hand, African American artists have been headed off at the pass, in some ways denied access to African art as the source for innovative development for new work, because it had already been either co-opted or completely absorbed by Western European artists who were doing their kind of neo-primitive thing. And so when black people were taken from Africa to here, what was cut off, in a way, was an evolutionary process that would have allowed the work they were making there to evolve into what we consider truly modern work now. And so that for people who are involved in Afrocentric and cultural nationalist movements, have always been trying to establish some kind of intimate relationship and link to an African origin from which black people now can make work that is uniquely their own. The whole black arts movement, in some ways, was about that kind of thing. If you go back to the Harlem Renaissance era, when Alain Locke was suggesting to African-American artists at the time that they used African themes and subjects in their work to make something that was distinctive and unique for black Americans. But because there was no continuity, this is to say the least, an interesting challenge. And because when you go to school to study art now, you only get to learn about Western European art history when you study. So that means you're doubly sort of cut off in your training from anything that's connected to African art. And so I had this idea, well, how do you, one of the things that in order to, and who knows how this work would have evolved? And so how do you create an evolutionary chain in which an artwork like these Ibeji figures evolve from the things they call primitive and tribal to become truly modern, but on their own terms, from doing things that occur within the work as opposed to having overlays that you put on top of the work. And if you go to the museum, and you could go even here at the Nelson-Atkins, and you look at the work, the African work in the collection, the first thing you will notice is that the work is static. Though many of the objects in the collection were meant to be moved, to be either danced with or they were run through the crowd so that you only got a glimpse of the object. They didn't make a lot of things that you were supposed to sit down in front of and just kind of stare at. Either things were moved around through the crowd so that you caught a glimpse of it, or they were danced in a celebration or ceremony or something like that. And even when there was work that was made to be in a shrine, that work is also sort of static and what people call archaic. And so I just thought, well, the first thing that you might want to do to a piece of African art is to not copy it, but to try to understand why that work looks the way it looks. And then to make it do things that the African art doesn't do. And one of the things that Ibejis and things don't do is they don't step forward and they don't turn in space. And so that's the beginning of a process where you can act on that object from inside the object itself and make it do things that it hadn't done before, and then through a process of acting on it again and again and again, change it so that it becomes something else, but something else on its own terms. And so this is the beginning of a process for me of starting to make sculpture that goes from this position where the figure steps forward and turns in space to now starting to act on it again and again and again until the thing becomes something else, but do all of the actions from within, from suggestions that are only derived from things that are happening within the piece, and see what you come out with. This is how you make new art. And if you remember that Richard Serra interview on Charlie Rose again, what did he describe in terms of how he created this new form of sculpture? When sculpture came off the pedestal. And he talked about coming back to New York after he had been in Rome during that Rome Prize. And he said, a ton of rubber, or maybe he said 10 tons of rubber, raw rubber, dropped off at his studio. And he did what? He made a verb list, he said. And he simply enacted all of the things on the verb list using that rubber, which, as you go, to lean, to fold, to bend, to roll, to prop. You simply do that. Just do those things. And when you do that kind of stuff happens. You see stuff that you can then capitalize on later. And that's an approach to making work that will get you closer to doing something that's fresh than trying to wait around for a thunderbolt to hit you. And you are inspired to make something new. It's the work. And this was the thing that N.C. Wyeth, we were talking about N.C. Wyeth, I used to want to be a children's book illustrator. And I was a really big fan of the whole Brandywine School of illustrators out of Howard Pyle and N.C. Wyeth, all those people. And N.C. Wyeth would say, it's like, you can grow old and die waiting for inspiration. Inspiration only comes when you're at work, when you're at the job of doing this thing, and then you see stuff. So anyway, so this is one of those things. We're gonna run out of time. I'm already way over. So sorry about that. Anyway, let me go fast, and then maybe we'll have 5 or 10 minutes for Q&A after. But let me do this, because don't get me started. I have to say. Anyway, so that's the piece, which sort of segues into I did a project at the Wexner Center that opened in February, and this was took me to Japan. Because I was studying and doing research on bunraku puppetry, or in Japan it's ninyo joruri. It's the Japanese word for what we in America call bunraku. And bunraku is a particular kind of puppetry it's a puppet that's 2/3 life-size, requires 3 people to operate. You got one person who operates the head and the left hand, and one person who operates the right hand, and one person who operates the feet. And then in that coordination, those 3 people make that puppet come to life. And so I wanted to do a puppet performance, a puppet show, based on the Rhythm Master comic project. And I had 23 high school kids who I trained to operate these puppets and to do the narration and all of that stuff. And they worked with me on this project at the Wexner. And this is the installation of the project with the puppets kind of as sculpture. When we did two days of performances. They did 4 performances on the opening day, the day after the opening, on the opening weekend. It was only for that. And then they had dress rehearsals that were open. But this is one of the puppets. That's a close-up of the Pharrell puppet. This is the set that the puppets played in, the performance took place in. That's puppet on the left over here is based on the Sinufo executioner figure. These are all puppets that were based on African sculpture that you would see in the museum as inanimate objects, but animated as puppets. Back there in the corner is an Oba figure from Benin. They got that great ceremonial sword out there in the collection here at the Nelson-Atkins. That's a close-up of that Sinufo figure. That's one of the girl puppet, Stacia. And then this is going back. This is an installation view of a show at the Renaissance Society, out of which that group of paintings that led to the Mementos 5 came. And so I'm going to show a couple of those, and I'm going to move fast. That's just a view of the rubber, stamps piece. This is the first one of that group of paintings I made, and the first two I made were in color. This one and this one. And the thing is that after I made those first two, I realized there was something about that color that was way too ostentatious for what I was trying to do with the subject. And I had just been at the Metropolitan in New York, and I saw this Odalisque and Grisaille by Ang at the Metropolitan. It is such a beautiful painting. It's one of the best things they have in their collection. It's such a beautiful painting. And when I saw that painting, the answer to this ostentatious sort of display in those works came clear. And I thought, yeah, that's what you got. You strip the color away. And then stripping the color does several things. One is that it locates the work in a time frame that is closer in tone and sense to the 1960s. And so that was really important. And the thing is that, but you could keep this dazzling kind of quality and keep the grayscale by going from gold glitter to silver glitter, And so that silver glitter still allows you to keep that dazzling kind of sparkly thing that's really important for catching the eye of a viewer. And so anyway, so I did a group of those paintings. There are 5 of them, as the Mementos 5 sort of closes out. But these are the first 2 paintings that represent people who had a political and social, whose lives had political and social importance to the 60s. This one has blues, jazz, and R&B musicians who died during the 1960s, but whose contribution to their fields was just immense. From Nat King Cole, Billie Holiday, Jimi Hendrix, Little Walter, John Coltrane, all of these people. Man, it's like if you think about that list of people, it's just unbelievable. Smokey Hawk. And then the Mementos 5 painting was when you're doing a group of work, you got to figure out some kind of way to close it. And I can't say it any simpler than that. And to me, the closure is you close the curtains on those spaces. You close the curtains on those spaces, and everything starts to dissipate, starts to fade away. And then you are left with just the kind of echoes of the things that were available in the other paintings. And then it's memories you're left with. It's the importance of those dates from 60 to 69. And then when you think about that period, you have to say, what a time, what a time. I mean, it's just that's the way those things sort of resonate. And it's like for generations of people who weren't born in the 50s, I was born in 1955. And so you're coming of age during the 1960s. And I don't know if there's been a period like that in the history of the United States where we experienced as children the assassination of a president in 1963, the assassination of Martin Luther King, who was a world leader everybody knew of, the assassination of Malcolm X, the assassination of Medgar Evers, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. I mean, it's like, can you imagine in your lifetime seeing all that? We saw and witnessed the shootouts and the destruction of the Black Panther Party. It's like, I went to Carver Junior High School in L.A., which was 5 blocks from the Black Panthers headquarters on Central Avenue, when they had the big shootout in which Geronimo Pratt ended up in prison from. That Chicago, 1960, 67, 68. But I'm not talking about the National Convention. I'm talking about Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. That was 69, wasn't it? 69. But can you imagine? This is what we experienced during the 1960s. And that's not even talking about the people who were being beaten and clubbed because they were trying to register to vote. I mean, can you imagine a period in which all of that stuff was happening and the kind of an impact that would have on the worldview of young people growing up? And that's just happening in the United States. But we saw in the 60s the proliferation of liberation struggles around the world, all of the African independence movements, the independence movements in India. I mean, this was that period. And so this is like, what a time. I mean, you got to say, what a time. Anyway, so I had to close the curtains on that. I didn't tell you, but I was telling Jan earlier that all of those, the living room, that in Mementos number 5, that's my mother's house in L.A. now. That's where that's setting. That's my mother's house. All of the previous, the one before that was my mother-in-law's best friend's house. One of the houses is my mother-in-law's house, and the other two, the first two in color, that's my wife's both of those are my wife's great aunt's houses. Now, both of them, the great aunts are now deceased. Ruth was 92 when she died. May was 84. Cheryl's mother is 82. My mother is 74. Lois Ricks, who is my mother-in-law's best friend, she is also 80 some odd years old. And I chose their houses for very specific reasons also. One is that during the 1960s, that would have been a period in which all those adults would have been right on, like everything that was happening for them would have been really meaningful in terms of their ability to either move into or not make it to the middle class. It's like depending on which side of the black liberation struggle you fell on, the civil rights side or the more radical side of the liberation struggle, your opportunities could or could not be more or less fulfilled. So that would have been a particularly meaningful time for them. The other thing was that if you looked at Ruth's house and May's house, when people made it into, kind of moved up a little bit in the world, their houses became like museum pieces. The living room you didn't go in the living room to sit down. It's like they had everything already encased in plastic or vinyl or something. You looked at that because that was an emblem of their success. And you didn't go in there to mess it up. So you kind of walked through it and you, nice couch, nice chair. I like that dinette set, those are some great end tables. But you didn't use the living room. You passed through. But anyway, I'll see. And then now this is the man. I really got to pick up the pace. I'm going to go really fast now. But this is the installation of the Rhythm Master project at the Carnegie. I'm not going to say anything about it. And there's a couple of images from that. Speed is of the essence. No. It's just a couple of things, just samplings. And somebody may ask about it if we have time. And then I'll go through this last group of works. I did a show at the MCA in Chicago called One True Thing, Meditations on Black Aesthetics. And it looked at all of the implications of that term and that idea and the kinds of works you could make from it. And the Mementos 5 was in that show. That's how it came to the Nelson-Atkins. But it was in that show. And that was a transition show from the Mementos paintings to another way of thinking. And that new way of thinking, in some ways, is this kind of scientific approach that I was telling you about, where you take all of these strategies of representation, you put them all in play, you learn how they work from the inside, and then you work them so that you can find out how to synthesize those things into something else that's completely new. So anyway, this is a group of part of a larger installation of works, but I did a couple of these ballerina pictures. These are all, the kind of stuff you can do with Photoshop. So that's kind of three movements. There was a work called The Art of Hanging Pictures that this photograph and another photograph were a part of, but this and that photograph. And then there were 7 other photographs that in a constellation of photographs that made up a kind of a narrative, a loose narrative. This is Black Christmas. And I did a group of photographs that were photographs of objects under black light. And so you get a Christmas tree. And the thing I like that black light is that blue color. If you take tungsten film and photograph ultraviolet light on it, you get that beautiful blue color in the whole thing. So this was, it's the reverse of the white Christmas, but it's the black Christmas. So it's a Christmas tree in black light. This is a picture called The Black Artist. And so that's me in the studio, kind of in the dark, looking at a painting, contemplating the work in the dark. And then that's a bottle tree. And for people somebody may ask about that, I'm not going to say it anymore. But, and then this was a part of that first suite. This was our neighbor, Dilworth. The Dilworths were next door, and Mr. Dilworth, the old man, had this Cadillac, which was great. It's like on his antenna in the back, he's got an American flag, the black nationalist flag, and then another little banner like underneath it. I thought that was just sort of great. And he walks around. He has his Marcus Garvey buttons. He's got his Black Panther buttons. It's like he was 80, like 80-year-old guy, but he was a radical 80-year-old. Oh, is that it? I don't think so. But let me. I thought there was one more, but I think that we're going to stop there because I think it's time. Okay, but anyway, that gives you some sense. I mean, if you look at the variety of things that I've been doing, I mean, it gives you some sense of what I see as the artist's enterprise. It's like, well, what do you do as an artist, and what are we trying to do? What we're really trying to do, we're trying to find some mode of representation that really maximizes the impact of the work you present, but also sort of sets up this possibility where you can, essentially you claim ownership of a treatment of a subject, a mode of representation, something that you can claim ownership of, because that is the only way you're going to be able to gain a secure position in the narrative history of art. I mean, it's like if you read it right, you got to see that we didn't get from Giotto to Duchamp to Jasper Johns to Warhol to Damien Hirst. We didn't get there by happenstance, really. Because if anything should be understood about the art world, is that for all the talk about individuality, for all the talk about difference, about creativity, about idiosyncrasy, for all that talk, there's an amazing amount of agreement from one institution to the next, from one art historian to the next, from one art critic to the next. There's an amazing amount of agreement about what kinds of things matter the most and what kinds of things don't matter at all. And you don't get that kind of agreement in a field in which there's this wild and radical sort of freedom that people claim for the arts. It is not a totally open field. Things only take hold at certain moments, under certain conditions, and in certain contexts. That's how change is sort of affected within the art world. And when change affects on one level, then it changes the way everybody else thinks about the kinds of things they can make. When Duchamp did the first ready-made in 1913, after that, it's like that led to everything that we knew that would end up being conceptual art in the 1970s. That conceptual art couldn't have happened without Duchamp. And then we know there are more than just a handful of people who did conceptual art, but when you read the books, there are a handful of people who are always there. And that's the goal. It's like when you read it in the art history book. I've never picked up an art history book that didn't have Andy Warhol in it. Never picked up one that didn't have Jasper Johns in it. Never picked up one that didn't have Andy Warhol in it. Never one without Michelangelo, never one without Raphael, never one without those people. How come? And you got to answer that question for yourself in order to position yourself so that you could be one of those people where you can say, there will never be another book written without me in it. So, anyway, good night. All right, so if there are any questions, I think we'll take, how many?
Let's say 3.
3 questions. Anybody got a question? I'll be more than happy to. Yes.
I was fortunate recently to spend some time with the women from G-Span whose quilts were at the Whitney and Keith Museum and other places. And now when those women made quilts, they didn't think they were making art, and they had never looked at an art history book. And somehow their work ended up, nevertheless, in a museum. And I think I'm coming from a place as a curator, I think it's really up to the institutions to expand notions of what belongs in the museums as opposed to artists trying to figure out so much how to get in. I mean, I really think institutional critique here, I think, because, you know, Elizabeth Murray just had a retrospective a few years ago at MoMA. She was only the 3rd woman to ever have a retrospective at MoMA.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whose fault is that? I mean, I think an artist can only do so much at any given time. It's really, at this point, up to the galleries, institutions, and museums to just gain some consciousness and start paying more attention, which I think is happening more now than ever before. But, I mean, I don't know, as an artist, how much power you really have.
Well, I think you have all the power. Really. Because the things you have to look, there are when you're talking about meaningfulness, it's like, well, what's meaningful and meaningful to who? I mean, you gotta, there are things that you have to deal with whether you like them or not. And then there are things that people deal with because they please them or satisfy them in some kind of way. And then there are things that people deal with because they perform a certain kind of function for them. They advance a certain idea that they want to advance. But there's a class of things that you have to deal with whether you like it or not. I'm interested in the class of things that you have to deal with and come to terms with whether you like it or not. Because, I mean, in a way, I think we make work for the people who don't know us and who don't like us. They are more important to me than the people who support me. Because the people who support me are invested in my well-being. They're invested in me. And their judgment can't always be trusted. It can't always be trusted because they like me and they want to see me do well. And so they will say things to me or say things about me that help boost my ego or help to affirm to other people that they are in my inner circle or they know me and things like that. But that's not reliable to me. That's really not reliable. And so you got to deal with what it is that the artworks that artists are doing, how they perform in the field. How do they perform? This has nothing to do with whether we like them or not, or whether I particularly think they're important. They are only, it's like in a competitive field, I mean, you really got to find something else other than sensibility as the factor that determines whether something is important or not. Now, there may be a lot of disagreement on who should and should not be in the museum. And you have to argue about it and fight about it and make a case for it. The problem with the art world is, in some ways, the artists, as people who make art, we think that the work is important simply because we made it. And that's just not true. I mean, it's not true. Everything I made is not good. I know that. Everything I made is not good. There are things that I wish I could have gotten back. And I know that Manet, Monet, and all of the work they made is not good. But it's useful to tell the story of art because they help change the perception of what paintings are supposed to look like. Now, if I come and I may make great impressionist paintings after Monet, after Pissarro, my paintings don't become important because they are good impressionist paintings. They're not as important as Pissarro's paintings because those are the paintings that laid the groundwork for me to be able to make the paintings I'm making. So I have some of the same issues, and it's like, and one of a really important artist for me was Charles White, and I had to come to terms with the fact that no matter what I thought of Charles White's work, it doesn't show up in the art history books really a whole lot, and I have to ask myself why. Is it something deficient in the work that he's making, or is it a deficiency in the people who are looking at his work and writing about it? It's not always a deficiency in the people who are looking at the work. I used to think it was only that. But that part of that was because I didn't take as deep a look at the work myself as I could have. And now it's good enough. It's certainly good enough to be in any museum. And the things like, there are a lot of artworks that people make that are useful for doing exhibitions and things. And they're useful in part because institutions like the Nelson-Atkins, like every college, university gallery, like all of the alternative space, these people have to do programming, then they have to do program 12 months out of a year. So they're going to put up some shows whether they think the work is great work or not. And that's why you see this proliferation of thematic shows. There's a lot of work that fits themes. It ain't all good work just because it fits the theme. It's useful because it can fill out the space. And there's a lot of work like that. There's a whole lot of work like that. I sit on a lot of grant review panels. And I would tell you that everybody who gets the grant doesn't get the grant because it's the best work. It's the best work in that group. So you make the best selection you can from the group of works you're looking at the time. That doesn't mean that work can go further than that. So we have, there's a deeper level of analysis that has to go to understanding how some of these decisions about things are made. And it's not always the thing that we feel is right. It's not always the thing that we feel is right. And I think if we operate, and this is the thing that I would say for me, and I think this is something that I think is particular for a lot of black people who want to be a part of what we call the mainstream, because black people have been fighting to become a part of the mainstream for a long time. But there are a lot of people who don't understand the terms under which those judgments are being made. I meet with a lot of young African-American artists who keep asking me, what do I have to do to be a part of this? And I have to tell them, and I tell a lot of students that when you sit on those grant review panels, if there are 300 people applying for a grant, 80% of those people are cut out in the first 20 minutes of the process. And there's no disagreement on why that 80% needs to be cut out. But the people who are sending their work in don't have a clue why their work never makes it past the first round. They think their work is worthy of being in there, or they wouldn't have sent it in, as far as I know. They don't, but what they don't know, and this is something this is what you don't get taught in school. They never tell you in school what the terms of engagement are. They lead you to believe that it's about this kind of self-expressive mode and that you're finding some kind of personal style, that somebody's going to recognize your genius if you have it. That's what they lead you to believe. But I think it's none of that. I think it's none of that. And so, unless if people think, let's say that Elizabeth Murray's work is that important, they have to make an argument for it that can butt heads with the anti-arguments for it in a way that gets to the heart of the matter. And the thing is, and I heard from people who thought that retrospective was still not an appropriate retrospective for her. And there are people, so you got to be able to argue with them on the terms that the work either should or should not be there. And you got to win. And you got to win. So, oops.
On that note, I think I'm afraid we're going to have to stop because we actually have to be out of the building.
Thank you.